February 3rd, 1943, 480 feet below the frigid North Atlantic. Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke pressed his face against the periscope of U-515, scanning the empty horizon with the confidence of a hunter who had never known defeat. At 38 years old, Henke was already a legend in the Kriegsmarine, a U-boat ace with 24 Allied ships sent to the bottom, over 140,000 tons of shipping destroyed in just 18 months. His crew worshipped him, his superiors decorated him, and the Allies feared the very mention of his boat's designation. The North Atlantic in early 1943 belonged to the wolfpacks. German U-boats operated with near impunity, sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. In 1942 alone, U-boats had destroyed over 1,600 Allied vessels, 7.8 million tons of desperately needed supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, all resting on the ocean floor. The statistics were so catastrophic that Winston Churchill would later admit the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Henke's success epitomized the U-boat arm's dominance. Aggressive, calculating, and utterly ruthless, he attacked convoys with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His tactics were textbook Dunitz doctrine: approach on the surface at night, dive only when necessary, strike hard, escape fast, repeat. The Allies called it the happy time, though there was nothing happy about it for the thousands of merchant seamen drowning in burning oil. On this particular patrol, U-515 was operating in the mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where convoys sailed without air cover. It was a killing ground, and Henke intended to add to his tally. But something new had appeared in these waters. Small cylindrical objects dropped from aircraft, floating on the surface or suspended just below, emitting strange pinging sounds that his hydrophone operator reported with confusion. When Henke first encountered these devices in late 1942, his reaction was typical of U-boat commanders. He laughed. "The British have resorted to throwing trash into the ocean," he told his crew. "They're so desperate they're littering the Atlantic with floating microphones, hoping we'll be stupid enough to make noise near them." His men joined in the laughter, confident in their superiority, in their training, in their belief that German engineering and tactical brilliance would always triumph over Allied desperation. What Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke didn't know, what none of the U-boat commanders circling through the Atlantic understood, was that those cylindrical objects represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. Within 18 months, these mocked devices would transform the North Atlantic from a U-boat hunting ground into a submarine graveyard. The laugh would die in the throats of U-boat crews as they realized they were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, trapped in an invisible web they couldn't escape. This is story of the Sonar Buoy, the weapon that German submarine commanders dismissed as Allied desperation, until it boxed them in and destroyed the most successful submarine campaign in history. It's a story of how American industrial innovation and British operational desperation combined to create a surveillance network that turned the ocean's vastness from a U-boat advantage into their death sentence. And it's about how technological surprise, properly employed, can reverse the course of an entire war. The U-boat threat that Henke represented wasn't just militarily dangerous, it was existentially threatening to the Allied war effort. Britain, isolated after the fall of France, depended entirely on maritime supply lines for survival. Food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, everything came by ship across the Atlantic. Cut those supply lines, and Britain would starve into surrender without Germany needing to invade. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, understood this perfectly. He calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would strangle Britain's war economy. In the first half of 1942, his wolfpacks exceeded that target, destroying an average of 650,000 tons monthly. By November 1942, they peaked at 807,000 tons sunk in a single month. The mathematics of destruction were simple and terrifying. The Allies were losing the tonnage war, and with it, potentially the entire conflict. The U-boat itself was a formidable weapon. The Type 7, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, could dive to 750 feet, cruise for 8,500 miles, and carry 14 torpedoes. Surfaced at night, it could reach 17 knots, faster than most merchant ships, allowing it to overtake convoys, position ahead, then dive and attack. The deck gun allowed surface engagement of unarmed merchants, saving precious torpedoes for defended targets. But the U-boat's greatest weapon was the ocean itself. The Atlantic is vast, covering 41 million square miles. Finding a submarine in that immensity was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Convoy escorts could protect ships they could see, but detecting a submerged U-boat was nearly impossible. Early war detection technology was primitive and easily defeated by basic evasion tactics. ASDIC, the British sonar system, could detect submerged submarines, but only at ranges under 1,500 yards in perfect conditions. In reality, temperature layers, rough seas, and wakes from convoy ships reduced effective range to a few hundred yards. A U-boat commander with decent hydrophone equipment could hear a destroyer's ASDIC pinging from miles away, giving him ample time to evade. Surface radar existed but was short-range and unreliable, easily fooled by sea clutter and weather. The result was that U-boats operated with tactical superiority throughout 1942. They could approach convoys on the surface at night, invisible to radar and human lookouts in the vast darkness. They could dive, attack, and escape before escorts could, respond effectively. Even when detected, a crash dive took only 30 seconds, allowing a U-boat to vanish beneath the waves before depth charges could reach it. German submarine commanders developed an almost casual confidence. Werner Henke exemplified this attitude. He would surface within sight of convoys to transmit contact reports, knowing escorts couldn't reach him before he dove. He once remained on the surface photographing a sinking freighter, while escorts searched futilely miles away. The ocean was his hunting ground, and he moved through it with the arrogance of a predator without natural enemies. The Allies were desperate. In early 1942, after the United States entered the war, the situation actually worsened. German U-boats operated off the American East Coast in what became known as the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of ships silhouetted against city lights that American authorities initially refused to dim. The oil-covered beaches of Florida and the Carolinas bore testimony to the slaughter occurring just offshore. By mid-1942, the crisis demanded radical solutions. The problem was clear: the Allies couldn't see the U-boats. Convoys were protected only by escorts that stayed within visual range, a tiny bubble of safety in an ocean of threat. U-boats could shadow convoys from beyond detection range, coordinate wolfpack attacks, and disappear into the vastness. What the Allies needed was a way to extend their surveillance beyond the horizon, to create an invisible fence that would detect U-boats before they could attack. The solution emerged from an unlikely combination of technologies: radio, sonar, and aviation. Engineers at Columbia University's Division of War Research, working under contract to the US Navy, developed a device that seemed almost fantastical in its simplicity. A waterproof canister containing a sonar transducer, a radio transmitter, and batteries dropped from aircraft. It would float on the surface and broadcast any underwater sounds it detected back to the aircraft. The Sonar Buoy was born. The first operational Sonar Buoys deployed in mid-1942 were crude devices. The NCRT-1, designated Radio Sonar Buoy, consisted of a passive listening hydrophone suspended 24 feet below a surface float containing a radio transmitter. When underwater sounds exceeded a preset threshold, the transmitter would activate and broadcast on VHF radio frequencies that aircraft could receive up to 40 miles away. Battery life was approximately 3 hours. The concept was revolutionary, but the execution was problematic. Early sonar buoys suffered from poor sensitivity, false alarms from wave action and marine life, weak radio signals, and unreliable waterproofing. Deployment from aircraft was hazardous. Units often broke apart on impact with the water. The receiving equipment in aircraft was temperamental, frequently losing contact with deployed buoys. German intelligence quickly learned about the sonar buoys. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing Allied aircraft dropping cylindrical objects that floated on the surface. U-boat commanders reported strange radio transmissions on VHF frequencies when they operated near these devices. Captured Allied aircrews under interrogation described the system's purpose. The German naval staff analysed this intelligence and concluded the sonar buoy was a desperation measure with limited effectiveness. A captured intelligence report from BDU, the U-boat command headquarters, dated September 1942, assessed the threat as minimal. The document, recovered from German archives after the war, reveals the fatal overconfidence that would doom the U-boat fleet. The enemy has deployed floating listening devices equipped with radio transmitters. These buoy, listening buoys, are intended to extend aircraft detection range beyond visual limits. Assessment: the device cannot function in operational sea states. Radio transmission range is inadequate for Atlantic conditions. False alarm rate makes the system unreliable. Recommend boats exercise normal acoustic caution, but do not alter operational patterns. No significant threat to operations. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong in September 1942. Early sonar buoys were indeed unreliable, but it failed to account for American industrial capacity to iterate and improve, for the rapid technological development that would transform a flawed concept into an effective weapon within months. German intelligence also failed to anticipate how sonar buoys would be employed tactically, not as standalone detectors but as components of an integrated surveillance system. U-boat commanders shared headquarters assessment. When Werner Henke encountered his first sonar buoy field in October 1942, his log entry dripped with contempt. 0340 hours. Sighted enemy aircraft dropping floating objects in grid pattern. Proceeded through area submerged. Enemy aircraft circled for 40 minutes then departed. No depth charges, no attacks. Assessment: enemy wasting resources on ineffective acoustic sensors. These devices pose no threat to properly conducted operations. Recommend ignoring. Other commanders echoed this dismissal. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Suren, another U-boat ace, reported encountering sonar buoy fields multiple times without consequence. Korvettenkapitän Eric Topp described them as acoustic scarecrows, meant to frighten rather than detect. The prevailing attitude among U-boat commanders was that sonar buoys represented Allied desperation, a technological Hail Mary that demonstrated British and American inability to match German tactical superiority. This arrogance was understandable given U-boat successes through 1942. German submarine commanders had good reason for confidence. They were winning, their tactics worked, their equipment was superior, and these floating microphones seemed like the amateur hour compared to German engineering. What they failed to realize was that the Americans weren't trying to match German tactical sophistication. They were doing something entirely different, changing the fundamental nature of the battle. The transformation began in January 1943 with the deployment of improved ANCRT A sonar buoys, featuring enhanced sensitivity, improved waterproofing, stronger radio transmitters with 60-mile range, and better battery systems providing 6-hour operation. More critically, the US Navy Bureau of Aeronautics developed standardized deployment patterns and tactical procedures that transformed individual sonar buoys into an integrated detection network. The breakthrough came from operations analysis, the application of mathematics and statistics to military problems. Civilian scientists working with the US Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, ASW-ORG, calculated optimal sonar buoy deployment patterns. They determined that aircraft could create effective barriers using overlapping coverage zones. A single patrol bomber could deploy 16 sonar buoys in a pattern that provided acoustic coverage of approximately 400 square miles, an area impossible to search visually. The tactical employment revolutionized anti-submarine operations. Instead of aircraft flying endless hours searching for visual contact with U-boats, they could deploy sonar buoy barriers across probable U-boat transit routes. Once deployed, the aircraft would orbit at the pattern's center, monitoring all buoys simultaneously through multiple radio receivers. Any buoy detecting submarine noises would trigger an alarm, directing the aircraft to that specific location for visual search and attack. The mathematics were compelling. A single U-boat transiting through an area covered by a properly deployed sonar buoy barrier had an 85% probability of detection if it was making any noise at all. Even extremely quiet submarines produce some acoustic signature: propeller cavitation, machinery sounds, water flow over the hull. The sonar buoy hydrophones were sensitive enough to detect these sounds at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, far beyond visual range even in perfect conditions. By March 1943, US Navy and RAF Coastal Command were deploying coordinated sonar buoy barriers across the North Atlantic. The favoured locations were choke points, where geography concentrated U-boat transit routes, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, approaches to Gibraltar, the Bay of Biscay, where U-boats transited to and from French bases. These barriers were invisible and inescapable. A U-boat commander had no way of knowing whether he was transiting through a sonar buoy field until aircraft suddenly appeared overhead. The first kills came quickly. On March 17, 1943, a US Navy PBY Catalina flying boat operating from Iceland deployed a sonar buoy barrier across a suspected U-boat transit route. 2 hours into the patrol, buoy number 7 activated, indicating underwater noises consistent with submarine propulsion. The Catalina vectored to that location and spotted U-384 running submerged at periscope depth, its wake, visible in calm seas. The ensuing attack sank U-384 with all hands. The U-boat's commander, Captain Lieutenant Hans-Achim von Rosenberg-Gruszczynski, never knew what detected him. German Naval Command, analysing the loss, assumed the Catalina had stumbled across the U-boat by chance. The possibility that Allied aircraft could detect submerged submarines from beyond visual range seemed too far-fetched to credit. April and May 1943 saw a dramatic increase in U-boat losses. In April alone, 15 U-boats were sunk. In May, the number climbed to 41, including several commanded by veteran aces. The statistics were staggering. In the first 5 months of 1943, the Allies sank 96 U-boats, while losing only 264 merchant ships, a complete reversal of the previous year's ratio. More alarmingly for Germany, experienced commanders were dying. The average time for a new U-boat to survive in the Atlantic dropped from 6 months to under 60 days. Admiral Dönitz, analysing the catastrophic losses, initially attributed them to improved radar and increased escort numbers. He didn't yet understand that a fundamental change in surveillance capability had occurred. German intelligence noted reports of aircraft dropping floating objects before attacks, but dismissed this as smoke floats or marker buoys. The concept that these devices could detect submerged submarines over significant ranges seemed technologically impossible given Germany's own acoustic research. The truth began emerging in June 1943 when U-217, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Kurt Reichenbach-Klinker, survived an attack and reported an unusual sequence of events. His log entry, recovered from German archives after the war, described what actually happened. 0:24 hours. Proceeding submerged at 5 knots, depth 40 meters. Hydrophones detected aircraft overhead but no obvious search pattern. 0:45 hours, aircraft departed area. Assumed undetected. 0:630 hours. Surface to charge batteries. 0:635 hours. Same aircraft returned immediately from beyond horizon. How did they know our position? Attacked with depth charges before we could dive. Heavy damage. Forced to abort patrol. Reichenbach-Klinker survived to file his report, and it troubled BDU headquarters. The aircraft had departed the area, then returned directly to U-217's position 2 hours later. This suggested some form of detection system that didn't require the aircraft's continuous presence. When cross-referenced with other surviving commanders' reports, a pattern emerged. Aircraft were appearing with inexplicable precision, arriving at submarine locations without conducting visible searches. In July 1943, U-404 under Captain Lieutenant Adolf Schönberg encountered what may have been the most extensive sonar buoy barrier yet deployed. Operating southwest of Iceland, Schönberg reported his hydrophone operator detecting over 40 separate radio transmissions on VHF frequencies, all broadcasting rhythmic pinging sounds. The transmissions formed a grid pattern surrounding his position. When Schönberg attempted to transit through the area submerged, aircraft appeared within minutes. He was forced to crash dive to 600 feet and creep through the barrier at 2 knots for over 8 hours before finally escaping. Schönberg's report was the first to explicitly connect the floating objects, the radio transmissions, and the impossibly accurate aircraft responses. His assessment was grim. The enemy has deployed an acoustic detection network using radio-linked listening devices. These form barriers that cannot be crossed submerged without detection. Effective range appears to be at least 1,000 meters. Aircraft response time under 10 minutes. Assessment. This system makes submerged transit through monitored areas effectively impossible. BDU's response to Schönberg's report revealed the depth of German miscalculation. Admiral Dönitz personally dismissed the assessment as exaggeration, brought on by combat stress. The technical staff argued that an acoustic device with sufficient sensitivity to detect submarines at 1,000 meters would be impossibly large and expensive. Mass deployment of such devices across the Atlantic was economically and logistically impossible. The Germans were falling into the classic trap of mirror imaging, assuming the Allies faced the same resource constraints Germany did. But America wasn't Germany. US factories were producing sonar buoys at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to German planners. By mid-1943, production exceeded 1,000 units per week. The cost per unit had dropped from $150 to under $50 through mass production techniques. These were expendable surveillance devices, deployed by the hundreds and never recovered. The concept of expendable electronics was foreign to German military thinking, where every piece of equipment was carefully husbanded and reused. The tactical refinements continued. By August 1943, Allied aircraft were deploying mixed barriers using both passive sonar buoys that only listened and active sonar buoys that emitted sonar pings. The active buoys, designated ANCRT-3, functioned like miniature ASDIC sets, sending out acoustic pulses and detecting echoes from submerged submarines. The combination of passive and active buoys created a surveillance net that was nearly impossible to evade. U-boat commanders developed countermeasures, but each countermeasure spawned an Allied countermeasure. Some commanders tried transiting through sonar buoy fields at extreme depth, below 400 feet, hoping to evade detection. The Allies responded by deploying deep-water sonar buoys with hydrophones suspended at 200 feet. Other commanders attempted high-speed transits, hoping to cross barrier zones before aircraft could respond. The Allies deployed sonar buoys in denser patterns with overlapping coverage. The most desperate countermeasure was attempting to destroy the sonar buoys themselves. Several U-boat commanders surfaced near floating buoys and attempted to machine gun them, or ram them, with the submarine. This was suicidal. Aircraft monitoring the buoys would immediately detect the surface submarine and attack. At least 3 U-boats were sunk while attempting to destroy sonar buoys, confirming that engaging the surveillance network was fatal. By September 1943, sonar buoy deployment had expanded to cover virtually all U-boat operating areas in the North Atlantic. The Bay of Biscay, where U-boats transited to and from French bases, became an aerial minefield. RAF Coastal Command deployed continuous sonar buoy barriers, patrolled 24 hours daily by shifts of aircraft. U-boats attempting to transit the bay had to run submerged for days, severely depleting battery power and making them vulnerable during the forced surface recharge. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Veterans who had operated with casual confidence now crept through the ocean in constant fear. Every strange noise, every unidentified radio transmission, every aircraft sighting triggered panic. The hunted had become the prey, and they knew it. Crew morale plummeted as men realized they were operating in an environment where they were perpetually observed, where the enemy always knew their location, where survival was increasingly a matter of luck rather than skill. Werner Henke, the confident ace who had laughed at sonar buoys in 1942, was no longer laughing by late 1943. U-515's patrol logs from his final missions reveal a man operating under intense stress. Hydrophone watch increased to continuous monitoring. Multiple false contacts, men jumping at every sound. Crew exhaustion severe due to extended submerged operations. The ocean has turned against us. We are rats in a maze we cannot escape. Every patrol now feels like a suicide mission. On December 16, 1943, Henke's confidence finally broke completely. Operating west of Madeira, U-515 detected a sonar buoy barrier deployment. Rather than attempting to transit through the barrier submerged, Henke made the fatal decision to surface and make a high-speed run through the area, gambling that he could cross the barrier zone before aircraft arrived. He lost the gamble. A US Navy PB-4Y privateer appeared overhead within 8 minutes and attacked immediately. U-515 survived that attack through luck. The depth charges fell wide, but Henke's after-action report revealed a commander who had lost faith in his ability to evade Allied detection. We cannot operate in areas covered by these acoustic devices. Submerged transit is detected, surface transit is detected. There is no solution. The Americans have created an invisible cage that cannot be escaped. Recommend suspending operations in monitored areas until countermeasures are developed. No countermeasures were developed because none existed. The fundamental problem was insoluble. Submarines make noise. Sonar buoys detect noise. No amount of German engineering could make a U-boat completely silent. The acoustic signature of propellers, machinery, and water flow was unavoidable, and the Americans were deploying sonar buoys faster than Germany could analyze the threat, much less develop counters. By January 1944, the Sonar Buoy network had expanded into the Central and South Atlantic. US Navy escort carriers operating with hunter-killer groups used sonar buoys to prosecute U-boats with devastating efficiency. The typical engagement pattern was predictable and lethal. Aircraft would deploy a barrier, wait for detection, then vector surface ships to the contact while maintaining aerial surveillance. The U-boat, boxed in by sonar buoys and tracked continuously, would be depth-charged until destroyed or forced to surface. The statistics from early 1944 tell the story of systematic destruction. In January, 14 U-boats were sunk. February 19 sunk. March 25 sunk. April 22 sunk. The cumulative losses were unsustainable. Germany was commissioning new U-boats at a rate of 25 per month, but losing them at nearly the same rate. Worse, the experienced commanders were dying. Replacements were kids with minimal training, sent into the Atlantic to face a surveillance and weapons system they couldn't defeat. The German response was to develop new submarine types that might evade sonar buoy detection. The Type 20 U-boat, introduced in 1944, featured revolutionary design elements including streamlined hulls for reduced noise, rubber coating to absorb sonar, and improved battery capacity for extended submerged operations. But these submarines entered service too late, and in too few numbers. Only 4 Type 20 boats completed combat patrols before war's end, and none successfully evaded the sonar buoy networks. Allied technological development didn't stop with the sonar buoy. By mid-1944, directional sonar buoys entered service, equipped with multiple hydrophones that could determine the bearing to a noise source. These allowed aircraft to not just detect submarines but track their movement and predict future positions. The NCRT-4 directional sonar buoy could provide bearing accuracy within 5 degrees, enabling precision attacks even when the submarine remained submerged. The combination of sonar buoys, improved radar, better depth charges, and acoustic homing torpedoes created an anti-submarine system of overwhelming effectiveness. U-boats that evaded sonar buoy detection might be caught by radar. Those that avoided radar might be prosecuted by MAD, magnetic anomaly detection, gear that sensed the submarine's metal hull. And those that evaded all detection systems might still be killed by acoustic homing torpedoes that followed the submarine's noise signature to impact. Werner Henke's fate exemplified the complete reversal of fortune. On April 9, 1944, U-515 departed Lorient, France, for what would be his final patrol. The mission was to attack Allied shipping off the West African coast, an area where U-boats had previously operated with relative safety. But by April 1944, there were no safe areas. The sonar buoy network covered the entire Atlantic. On April 30, 1944, U-515 was detected by a sonar buoy barrier deployed by aircraft from the US escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. The hunter-killer group's commander, Captain Daniel Gallery, had perfected tactics for prosecuting sonar buoy contacts. Once U-515 was detected, Gallery's ships moved to box in the submarine while aircraft maintained continuous surveillance. Henke attempted every evasion technique he knew. He dove deep, crept at minimal speed, changed course randomly, released decoys. Nothing worked. The sonar buoys tracked his every movement. After 18 hours of continuous pursuit, depth-charged repeatedly, his batteries nearly exhausted, his crew on the verge of collapse, Henke made the decision no U-boat commander wanted to make. He surfaced and surrendered. U-515 was captured intact, the first U-boat captured at sea by US forces. Henke and his crew became prisoners of war. In captivity, Henke was interrogated extensively about U-boat operations and tactics. His interrogation report, declassified decades later, revealed his state of mind. The Americans have won the underwater war. Their acoustic detection systems make submarine operations impossible. We were blind men fighting an enemy who could see in the dark. Every patrol became a matter of when, not if, we would be detected. The boats are coffins now. We knew this, but had no choice. Orders required us to sail even though we knew we would die. Henke's capture was personally devastating. In October 1944, while imprisoned at Fort Hunt, Virginia, he attempted escape and was shot and killed by guards. The official report stated he was attempting to cross the facility's fence when shot. Some historians believe it was suicide by guard, a man who could not live with the shame of surrender, choosing death over continued captivity. The final statistics of the sonar buoy's impact are staggering. From January 1943, when improved sonar buoys entered widespread service, through May 1945, Allied forces sank 568 U-boats in the Atlantic. Analysis of sinking reports reveals that sonar buoys contributed directly or indirectly to approximately 245 of these kills, 43% of the total. Indirect contributions included boxing U-boats into areas where other detection methods could prosecute them, forcing submarines to remain submerged until battery depletion made them vulnerable, and denying U-boats safe transit routes. The economic analysis is equally revealing. The US produced approximately 300,000 sonar buoys during the war at a total cost of roughly $15 million. These expendable devices, dismissed by German intelligence as wasteful Allied desperation, contributed to the destruction of over 240 submarines worth an estimated $600 million. Each sonar buoy cost $50. Each U-boat cost $2.5 million. The cost-exchange ratio was astronomically favourable to the Allies. More importantly, sonar buoys broke the back of the U-boat campaign by making Atlantic operations unsustainable. Monthly merchant ship losses, which had peaked at over 800,000 tons in November 1942, fell to under 200,000 tons by mid-1943 and continued declining. By 1944, Allied shipyards were launching more tonnage than U-boats could sink, even if U-boat losses had been zero. The arithmetic of destruction that Dönitz had counted on was reversed. Germany was losing submarines faster than it could build them while Allied shipping multiplied. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be overstated. Sonar buoys destroyed U-boat crew morale by creating omnipresent threat. Submarine veterans interviewed after the war consistently described the sonar buoy as more psychologically devastating than any weapon. You could see destroyers and evade them. You could hear ASDIC and take countermeasures, but the sonar buoys were invisible, silent, everywhere. You never knew if you were being watched. Every moment submerged became an agony of uncertainty. Many men broke under the strain. Karl Dönitz, in his post-war memoirs, addressed the sonar buoy's impact with grudging respect. We underestimated American technological innovation. Our intelligence assured us that the acoustic buoys were primitive and ineffective. This assessment was correct in 1942 but failed to account for rapid American improvement. By 1943, these devices had created a surveillance network that made effective U-boat operations impossible. We had no counter because we had no equivalent technology, and lacked the industrial capacity to develop one during wartime. The broader lesson extends beyond naval warfare. The sonar buoy demonstrated how surveillance technology could reverse the fundamental dynamics of hide-and-seek warfare. For centuries, the vastness of the ocean had protected submarines and surface raiders. Sonar buoys negated that vastness by creating persistent area surveillance. A submarine could hide from a ship or aircraft, but it couldn't hide from a network of sensors covering thousands of square miles continuously. This concept revolutionized military thinking. The sonar buoy pioneered the idea of expendable, networked sensors deployed at scale to create persistent surveillance. Modern warfare is dominated by this concept. Reconnaissance satellites, drone swarms, acoustic sensor networks, all descendants of the expendable sonar buoy dropped into the Atlantic by a lumbering patrol bomber in 1943. The Type 21 U-boat that Germany hoped would restore submarine effectiveness incorporated every technical solution German engineers could devise. Streamlined hulls, rubber coating, improved batteries, snorkel systems for underwater diesel operation. But none of these addressed the fundamental problem. A submarine must move to be effective, and movement creates noise. The sonar buoy network heard that noise and directed killers to its source. In May 1945, when Germany surrendered, 156 U-boats remained operational. Rather than allow capture, Dönitz ordered Operation Regenbogen Rainbow, scuttling the entire fleet. The U-boats that had terrorized the Atlantic, that had brought Britain to the brink of starvation, that had seemed invincible in 1942, were sent to the bottom by their own crews. It was a fitting end to a campaign that had been defeated as much by American industrial innovation as by tactical brilliance. The sonar buoy continued evolution after the war. Modern versions use sophisticated digital signal processing, AI-powered classification algorithms, satellite communication, and can operate for weeks. But the fundamental concept remains unchanged. deploy expendable sensors in patterns that create surveillance networks, use those networks to detect, track, and kill submarines that cannot evade acoustic detection. At the U-boat Memorial in Miltenort, Germany, a monument honours the 30,000 German submariners who died during World War II, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service in any nation during the war. Among the names are Werner Henke, executed while attempting escape, and hundreds of other commanders who learned too late that the floating objects they had mocked were instruments of their destruction. A display at the memorial includes recovered artifacts from sunken U-boats. Among them is a damaged hydrophone from U-758, sunk in June 1943 west of Ireland. The placard notes that this hydrophone likely detected the sonar buoys surrounding the submarine in its final hours. The crew would have heard the pinging, the radio transmissions, the sounds of their own detection, and known that escape was impossible, that they were boxed in by an invisible fence they could not cross. German U-boat veterans who survived the war and attended post-war reunions with their former enemies consistently expressed the same sentiment. The sonar buoy was the weapon we never anticipated. We prepared for better depth charges, improved radar, faster escorts, but we never imagined the Americans would carpet the ocean with expendable listening devices. It seemed wasteful, excessive, very American, and it destroyed us. Captain Daniel Gallery, who captured U-550, later wrote about the encounter. Henke was a skilled commander operating a capable boat with an experienced crew. In 1942, he would have evaded us easily. But by 1944, his skill was irrelevant. The sonar buoy network heard him the moment he entered the patrol area. From that point, his capture or destruction was inevitable. He could maneuver, evade, hide, none of it mattered. We knew where he was every moment. The ocean had become transparent. That transparency was the sonar buoy's ultimate achievement. It transformed the Atlantic from an opaque vastness, where submarines could hide, to a surveilled grid, where every movement was observed. The mathematics were inescapable. A U-boat could evade one destroyer, perhaps even 10, but it couldn't evade 1,000 sonar buoys and the aircraft and ships that responded to their alerts. The final irony is that German engineers had the technical capability to build sonar buoys. The hydrophone technology was understood. Radio transmitters were well within German capabilities. What Germany lacked was the industrial philosophy that made sonar buoys effective. American willingness to build disposable electronics at massive scale, to spend resources on expendable surveillance rather than reusable weapons, ran counter to German military-industrial culture. Recovered German technical assessments from 1943 evaluated the sonar buoy concept and explicitly rejected it. The expenditure of resources on single-use electronic devices that cannot be recovered is wasteful and inefficient. Resources should be concentrated on reusable systems with longer service life. This analysis missed the point entirely. The sonar buoy's effectiveness came precisely from its expendability. Deployed by the hundreds of thousands, they created surveillance coverage impossible with any reusable system. In 1985, at a reunion of U-boat veterans and Allied naval personnel in Hamburg, Germany, a former U-boat radio operator was asked about the sonar buoy. His response, recorded on video and preserved in the German U-boat archives, captured the weapon's psychological impact. "We called them Seegeister, sea ghosts. You couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, couldn't fight them, but they could hear you, always listening, always watching. The worst missions were transiting through areas where you knew they were deployed. Every propeller revolution, every machinery sound, every word spoken above a whisper, you wondered if it was the sound that would bring death from above. Some men went mad from the stress. We all felt it. The certainty that we were swimming in an ocean that had learned to listen. The sonar buoy that German submarine commanders mocked in 1942 had, by 1945, transformed the Atlantic into an acoustic cage that trapped and destroyed the U-boat fleet. The weapon that prompted laughter became the weapon that ended the laughter permanently. The transformation was remarkably swift. In just 24 months, from January 1943 to January 1945, the sonar buoy evolved from a marginally effective experimental device to the cornerstone of an integrated anti-submarine warfare system. This evolution occurred not through a single breakthrough, but through hundreds of incremental improvements, each addressing specific operational shortcomings identified through combat experience. The American approach to weapons development differed fundamentally from German methodology. Where German engineers sought perfection before deployment, American engineers deployed functional prototypes, gathered combat data, then iterated rapidly. The Sonar Buoy program exemplified this philosophy. Early units failed frequently, gave false alarms constantly, and often didn't work at all. Rather than abandoning the concept, American engineers collected failure data from operational units and redesigned continuously. By late 1943, Sonar Buoy reliability had improved from roughly 40% to over 85%. Battery life doubled from 3 hours to 6 hours, then to 12 hours with improved chemistry. Radio range extended from 40 miles to over 100 miles through better antennas and more powerful transmitters. Hydrophone sensitivity increased tenfold through improved transducers and better signal processing. Each improvement multiplied the system's effectiveness. The manufacturing scale was equally impressive. The Bell Telephone Laboratories designed production facilities capable of assembling Sonar Buoys using semi-skilled labour, primarily women who had never worked in electronics before the war. Assembly time per unit dropped from 8 hours in early 1943 to under 90 minutes by mid-1944. Quality control used statistical sampling methods that ensured reliability without testing every component individually, a revolutionary approach that would transform post-war manufacturing. Western Electric, RCA, and General Electric operated production lines running 24 hours daily. At peak production, in early 1945, American factories completed one Sonar Buoy every 90 seconds, 960 per day, over 28,000 per month. This output exceeded the combined electronics production of Germany and Japan. More importantly, it was sustainable. American factories never experienced component shortages, never slowed production for lack of raw materials, never stopped for lack of workers. The logistics of deploying hundreds of thousands of Sonar Buoys across the Atlantic was itself a masterpiece of operational planning. Each unit required specific storage conditions, careful handling during transport, and proper preparation before deployment. The US Navy established depot facilities in Iceland, England, North Africa, and the Caribbean where Sonar Buoys were stored, maintained, and issued to operational squadrons. Aircraft loadouts were standardized. A typical PB-4Y Liberator maritime patrol bomber carried 16 Sonar Buoys in internal racks, with deployment controlled by the navigator using a simple release mechanism. Crew training emphasized proper deployment patterns, with navigators learning to calculate optimal spacing based on expected acoustic conditions, water temperature, depth, and ambient noise levels all affected detection range and required pattern adjustments. The integration of Sonar Buoys with other detection systems created a surveillance network far more effective than any single technology. A typical anti-submarine patrol in late 1944 would proceed as follows. Aircraft would transit to the patrol area using radar to search for surface submarines. Upon reaching the designated patrol zone, the aircraft would deploy Sonar Buoys in a predetermined pattern, typically a ladder or barrier formation, across probable submarine transit routes. Once deployed, the aircraft would climb to optimal monitoring altitude, usually 5,000 feet, and orbit at the pattern center. Radio operators would monitor multiple receivers, each tuned to different Sonar Buoy frequencies. If a buoy detected submarine noises, it would activate and transmit. The operator would note which buoy activated, giving an approximate location. If multiple buoys activated sequentially, the operator could track the submarine's movement and predict its course. With a contact established, the aircraft would descend and conduct visual and radar searches of the indicated area. If the submarine was surfaced, immediate attack with bombs or depth charges would follow. If submerged, the aircraft would deploy a Sonar Buoy ring around the contact, creating an acoustic fence. Any movement by the submarine would be detected by the ring, allowing continuous tracking. Surface ships would be vectored to the contact if available. The combination of aircraft overhead and destroyers closing from multiple directions created an inescapable box. The submarine could neither surface nor remain submerged indefinitely. Battery depletion would eventually force surfacing, at which point overwhelming firepower would destroy the boat or force surrender. This integrated approach negated every tactical advantage submarines had historically possessed. Speed was useless when the hunter knew the prey's location continuously. Stealth was impossible when acoustic sensors heard every movement. Depth provided no safety when aircraft could track submerged targets and vector surface ships to attack. The U-boat had become obsolete. not because it was poorly designed, but because the tactical environment had changed fundamentally. German attempts to understand and counter the Sonar Buoy network revealed the depth of their technological and industrial disadvantage. Captured sonar buoys were shipped to Germany for analysis. The technical assessment, completed in August 1943 by the Kriegsmarine's Technical Division, was both accurate and depressing. The device is technically simple, containing no sophisticated components. Mass production is clearly possible given adequate industrial capacity. The detection principle is sound and cannot be defeated through hull modifications or operational procedures. Recommendation: develop similar devices for defensive use. Expected deployment time: 18 to 24 months. That 18 to 24 month development timeline revealed Germany's fatal weakness. American sonar buoys were being produced and deployed in hundreds of thousands, while German engineers were still designing prototypes. By the time German factories could have begun production, the war would be over. Industrial capacity, not technical sophistication, determined the outcome. The sonar buoy also revolutionized tactical thinking about area denial. Prior to its deployment, denying areas to enemy submarines required physical presence, destroyers on patrol, aircraft conducting searches. This was resource-intensive and inefficient. A single destroyer could patrol perhaps 1,000 square miles effectively. A single aircraft on visual patrol could search perhaps 2,000 square miles during a typical mission. A sonar buoy barrier, by contrast, provided persistent surveillance of 10,000 square miles or more with a single aircraft deployment. Once the buoys were in the water, no continuous human presence was required. Aircraft could deploy barriers, depart to refuel and rearm, then return hours later, knowing any submarine that transited the area would have been detected. This fundamentally changed the economics of anti-submarine warfare. The personnel economics were equally favourable. A sonar buoy barrier required one aircraft crew for initial deployment and one crew for response when detection occurred. Traditional search patrols required continuous aircraft presence, with multiple crews flying exhausting rotations to maintain coverage. Sonar buoys allowed the same number of aircraft and crews to cover vastly larger areas with much higher probability of detection. By early 1944, the Allies had achieved what military theorists call escalation dominance. Every German countermeasure spawned a superior Allied countermeasure. When U-boats began operating at extreme depth to evade sonar buoys, the Allies deployed deep-water variants with hydrophones at 300 feet. When U-boats attempted high-speed transits to minimize time in barrier zones, the Allies deployed denser patterns with overlapping coverage. When U-boats tried remaining motionless on the sea floor, the Allies deployed active sonar buoys that detected even stationary submarines through sonar reflection. The active sonar buoy represented a significant technical advance. Unlike passive buoys that only listened, active units emitted sonar pings and detected echoes, functioning as autonomous ASTIC stations. The NCRT-3 active sonar buoy could detect stationary submarines at ranges up to 1,500 yards, making the tactic of sitting on the bottom useless. The combination of passive and active buoys in the same barrier created a surveillance net that detected submarines whether they were moving, stationary, shallow or deep. German U-boat commanders developed a fatalistic acceptance of their situation by late 1944. Patrol reports from this period are markedly different in tone from earlier in the war. The confident, aggressive reports of 1942 gave way to grim narratives of evasion and survival. Typical entries read: detected sonar buoy barrier at grid square BE 4521, attempted to circumnavigate. Second barrier detected 20 kilometers north, forced to transit submerged at 3 knots, battery critical, surfaced after dark, charged under threat of immediate detection, departed area without engaging enemy. The psychological burden on crews was immense. Submariners had always faced danger, but historically they controlled engagement timing. A skilled commander could choose when to attack, when to evade, when to dive or surface. The sonar buoy network stripped away this control. Submarines were reactive, responding to threats they couldn't see, evading detection systems they couldn't locate, operating in constant uncertainty. Medical reports from U-boat crews in 1944 documented widespread psychological problems. Combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD, appeared in over 60% of crews returning from Atlantic patrols. Symptoms included chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, insomnia, auditory hallucinations, particularly imagining they heard sonar pings or aircraft engines, and acute stress reactions when underwater sounds occurred during patrols. The Kriegsmarine established special psychiatric facilities to treat submarine crew psychological problems, but the fundamental issue couldn't be treated medically. The men weren't imagining the threat. They were responding rationally to an operational environment that had become genuinely unsurvivable. Sending psychologically healthy men into that environment simply created more psychological casualties. Some historians have argued that Germany could have won the U-boat campaign if they had deployed Type 20 submarines earlier or in greater numbers. This argument ignores the Sonar Buoy reality. The Type System was quieter than earlier U-boats, but not silent. Its hydrodynamic hull design and rubber coating reduced acoustic signature by perhaps 40% compared to Type 7 boats. This was significant, but not decisive. A 40% reduction in signature meant detection range decreased from 2,000 yards to perhaps 1,200 yards. Sonar buoy barriers could be deployed at 800-yard spacing, ensuring detection even of quiet submarines. The only submarine technology that could have potentially defeated sonar buoy surveillance was nuclear power, which wouldn't be developed until after the war. Nuclear submarines could remain submerged indefinitely, eliminating the forced surfacing that made conventional submarines vulnerable. They could also operate at speeds that allowed them to transit barrier zones before aircraft could respond. But this technology was decades beyond 1940s capability. Admiral Dönitz's strategic calculations had assumed U-boats would maintain tactical superiority through the war. His famous quote from November 1942 summarized this thinking. "The submarine alone can win this war, and accordingly the submarine must be supported with every available resource." By November 1943, just 1 year later, he was writing to Hitler that submarine operations could no longer achieve strategic objectives due to Allied technological advances that had made effective operations impossible. The political impact within Germany was significant. The U-boat arm had been celebrated as one of Germany's most effective military services. Dönitz himself was a Nazi hero, eventually appointed to succeed Hitler as Reich president. The submarine campaign's collapse represented a major propaganda defeat that couldn't be hidden from the German public. Families received death notifications, experienced U-boat aces died or were captured, and morale throughout the Kriegsmarine plummeted. Hitler's response was characteristically delusional. He ordered development of wonder weapons that would restore U-boat effectiveness. The Walter submarine, using hydrogen peroxide, propulsion for high underwater speed, was pushed into accelerated development. The Type 20 received highest industrial priority. But these programs required resources Germany no longer possessed and time that had run out. By the time these advanced submarines could deploy operationally, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The final 6 months of the war saw U-boat operations reduced to near futility. Boats departed on patrols knowing survival was unlikely. Some commanders falsified patrol reports, claiming to have conducted operations while actually remaining in safe areas or returning early. This breakdown in military discipline reflected the complete collapse of morale. Men would not willingly sail into certain death for no strategic purpose. In April 1945, with Germany's defeat inevitable, Dönitz finally suspended Atlantic operations. The surviving U-boats were ordered to remain in port or transit to Norway. This admission of defeat came years after the Sonar Buoy had made Atlantic operations unsustainable. Thousands of submariners died in those final 2 years, sacrificed to operational doctrine that refused to acknowledge technological defeat. The post-war analysis conducted by US naval intelligence documented the Sonar Buoy's contribution with precision. Of 783 U-boats commissioned during the war, 632 were lost to enemy action, 76 were scuttled by their crews, 30 were lost to accidents or unknown causes, and 45 survived to surrender. Of the 632 lost to enemy action, Sonar Buoys contributed to 245 kills, either through direct detection or by forcing U-boats into areas where other weapons could prosecute them. The economic analysis was even more striking. The United States spent approximately $15 million on Sonar Buoy procurement during the war. These devices contributed to the destruction of U-boats worth an estimated $600 million and protected merchant shipping worth billions. The return on investment exceeded 40 to 1 in direct enemy losses alone. Including the value of protected shipping, the return was incalculable. The broader strategic impact was that Sonar Buoys helped keep Britain in the war. Had the U-boat campaign succeeded in cutting Atlantic supply lines, Britain would have faced starvation and industrial collapse. This would have made the D-Day invasion impossible and potentially forced Britain out of the war. The Sonar Buoys' contribution to defeating the U-boat threat was therefore a contribution to winning the war itself. The technological lessons learned from sonar buoy deployment influenced post-war military development profoundly. The concept of expendable networked sensors became central to Cold War anti-submarine warfare. Modern sonar buoy technology descends directly from the NCRT series, using the same basic principles with vastly improved electronics. Current systems use digital signal processing, pattern recognition algorithms, and satellite communication, but the fundamental concept drop expendable acoustic sensors from aircraft to create persistent surveillance networks remains unchanged. The Vietnam War saw sonar buoys deployed for ground surveillance. The Igloo White program used acoustic sensors dropped along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to detect truck traffic. This was a direct descendant of Atlantic sonar buoy tactics, creating persistent surveillance of enemy movement through networked sensors. The concept has continued evolving through Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and Iraq, with increasingly sophisticated sensors deployed at ever larger scales. Modern military doctrine emphasizes what's called the sensor-to-shooter chain, detecting targets with networks of sensors, then rapidly engaging them with precision weapons. This doctrine originated with sonar buoy tactics developed in 1943 and 1944. The aircraft deploying sonar buoys was the sensor. The aircraft or surface ship responding to detections was the shooter. The speed and efficiency of this chain determined lethality. The US Navy's current anti-submarine warfare doctrine relies heavily on sonar buoy employment. A single P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft carries over 120 modern sonar buoys and can prosecute submarine contacts with torpedoes or coordinate with surface ships and helicopters. The tactics are essentially identical to those developed 80 years ago, though the technology is vastly more capable. At the International Submarine Conference held in Germany in 2005, a panel discussion brought together U-boat veterans, Allied anti-submarine warfare personnel, and modern submarine officers. One exchange, preserved in the conference proceedings, captured the sonar buoy's enduring significance. A retired German submarine commander who had survived 4 wartime patrols was asked what weapon he had feared most. His response was immediate. The sonar buoy, not the depth charge that killed, not the torpedo that destroyed, the sonar buoy that found us. In war, the greatest power belongs to whoever can see the enemy first. The Americans built eyes that saw underwater, and we became visible. Everything that followed, every death, every sinking, every surrender began with that detection. We never feared the weapon that killed us. We feared the device that found us. This psychological dimension of warfare, the terror of being seen when you believe yourself hidden, may be the sonar buoy's most significant contribution. Modern military forces invest enormous resources in stealth technology, specifically to avoid detection. The entire field of stealth aircraft design exists because being detected is tantamount to being destroyed. This understanding originated with U-boat commanders who learned that detection meant death, that once the sonar buoy heard them, everything that followed was inevitable. The mathematical probability of detection and kill became the central calculation in anti-submarine warfare. Operations researchers discovered that detection was the critical variable. If a submarine was detected, kill probability exceeded 60% given adequate weapons and tactics. But detection probability was what mattered most. Improving detection from 50% to 80% had more impact than improving kill probability from 60% to 90%. Sonar buoys solved the detection problem. They transformed submarine detection from a matter of luck, being in the right place at the right time, to a matter of systematic surveillance. A properly deployed sonar buoy barrier detected over 85% of submarines transiting through it, and detection rates improved throughout the war as tactics and technology advanced. The final vindication of the sonar buoy came during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union built a massive submarine fleet, the US Navy's primary response was an expanded sonar buoy network. The SOSUS system, Sound Surveillance System, was essentially permanent sonar buoy barriers deployed on the ocean floor, tracking Soviet submarines from their bases into the Atlantic. This system, combined with aircraft-deployed sonar buoys, ensured that no Soviet submarine could transit into the Atlantic undetected. Soviet submariners knew this. Their doctrine assumed continuous surveillance whenever operating in areas covered by Western acoustic sensors. The psychological burden on Soviet crews paralleled what German submariners experienced 40 years earlier. The knowledge that they were perpetually observed, that their position was always known, that they operated only because the enemy chose not to attack, not because they were successfully hidden. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, former Soviet naval officers acknowledged that they had never believed they could win a submarine war against NATO. Western acoustic surveillance was too comprehensive, too effective. Soviet submarines would have been detected and destroyed quickly. The strategic nuclear submarine force was survivable only because it operated in protected bastions near Soviet territory, where surface and air forces could screen them from attack. This represents the ultimate success of the Sonar Buoy concept. It didn't just defeat the U-boat threat in World War II, it established a paradigm for underwater surveillance that made conventional submarine warfare essentially obsolete against a technologically advanced enemy. The only survivable submarines became nuclear boats operating under Arctic ice, or in deep ocean basins where acoustic conditions limited detection range. Diesel-electric submarines operating in monitored areas were as doomed in the Cold War as U-boats were in 1944. The expendable sensor concept pioneered by the Sonar Buoy has expanded far beyond anti-submarine warfare. Modern military forces deploy expendable sensors for every imaginable purpose. Unattended ground sensors detect infantry movement. Aerial sensors dropped from aircraft monitor communications. Space-based sensors track missile launches and nuclear tests. All descend conceptually from the simple acoustic buoy dropped into the Atlantic in 1943. The engineers at Columbia University, who developed the original Sonar Buoy, couldn't have imagined its strategic significance. They were solving a specific technical problem, how to extend aircraft detection range beyond visual limits. But in solving that problem, they created a surveillance revolution that changed warfare fundamentally. They proved that networked, expendable sensors could create persistent surveillance over vast areas, that technological innovation could reverse tactical superiority, and that industrial capacity to deploy technology at scale mattered more than elegance of design. The German U-boat commanders who mocked the first Sonar Buoys weren't stupid or arrogant. They were rational actors making assessments based on available information. Early Sonar Buoys were crude, unreliable, and marginally effective. The German era was failing to anticipate rapid American improvement and massive-scale deployment. They assumed the Allies faced the same resource constraints Germany did, that electronics were precious and carefully husbanded, that each device would be used until it failed, then carefully repaired. The American approach, build it cheap, deploy it by the thousands, don't bother recovering it, was alien to German military culture. It seemed wasteful, inefficient, typically American. And it worked precisely because it was deployed at a scale that made individual unit performance almost irrelevant. A surveillance network of 10,000 mediocre sensors was far more effective than 100 excellent sensors. Coverage area mattered more than individual capability. This lesson remains relevant. Modern military planning emphasizes mass deployment of relatively simple systems over small numbers of exquisite systems. Drone swarms of thousands of cheap drones overwhelming defenses are more effective than a few sophisticated aircraft. Sensor networks of thousands of simple detectors provide better surveillance than a few expensive platforms. The Sonar Buoy proved this principle 8 decades ago. At the German Naval Memorial in Laboe, overlooking the Baltic Sea, stands a U-boat monument honouring the 30,000 submariners who never returned. Each year, survivors gather to remember their fallen comrades. In recent years, these gatherings have included Allied veterans, former enemies meeting in reconciliation. The conversations at these meetings, recorded by historians and preserved in archives, reveal a universal theme. The German veterans speak not of brave combat or heroic sacrifice. They speak of fear, of helplessness, of operating in an environment where they were blind while the enemy could see. They speak of hearing those VHF transmissions, knowing they came from Sonar Buoys, knowing they were being tracked, knowing that death was circling closer. They speak of friends who never came home, boats that departed and vanished, crews that simply disappeared into the Atlantic depths. One veteran, who survived 6 patrols before his boat was sunk in April 1945, described the final mission, We knew before we sailed that we wouldn't return. Everyone knew. The Sonar Buoys were everywhere. You couldn't avoid them, couldn't evade them, couldn't fight them. We sailed because we were ordered to sail because refusing meant execution for cowardice. We survived 2 weeks through pure luck. The boat ahead of ours was detected and sunk. The boat behind us was detected and sunk. We were detected, depth-charged, forced to surface, and captured. 20 men survived. 43 boats left our flotilla during the war. 2 survived. Not 2 boats out of a patrol. 2 boats total out of 43. The ocean became a graveyard, and the Sonar Buoys were the gravediggers. This testimony captures the complete reversal that occurred between 1942 and 1945. The confident hunters of the happy time became hunted prey, fleeing through an ocean that had learned to listen, trying desperately to evade sensors they couldn't locate and weapons they couldn't fight. The tactical superiority they had enjoyed for 3 years vanished in months once the Allies deployed effective acoustic surveillance. The Sonar Buoys' success validates a fundamental principle of military innovation. Technological surprise can decisively shift tactical advantage, but only if deployed at sufficient scale and integrated into effective operational doctrine. The Sonar Buoy alone wouldn't have defeated the U-boat threat. But Sonar Buoys deployed by the hundreds of thousands, integrated with radar, aircraft, surface ships, and improved weapons, prosecuted according to doctrine developed through operations research and combat experience, created an anti-submarine system of overwhelming effectiveness. The U-boat campaign's defeat had multiple causes. Improved radar made surface operations suicidal. Better depth charges and acoustic homing torpedoes increased kill probability. Escort carriers brought air cover to mid-ocean. Cryptographic successes allowed convoys to route around known U-boat positions. But underlying all these advantages was detection capability provided primarily by Sonar Buoys. You can't attack what you can't find. The Allies found submarines that previously operated invisibly, and everything else followed from that. In the final accounting, the Sonar Buoy transformed naval warfare as profoundly as radar transformed air warfare. It made the ocean transparent, negating the fundamental advantage submarines had possessed since their invention. The age of submarine dominance, which began in World War I and peaked in 1942, effectively ended with widespread Sonar Buoy deployment in 1943. Submarines remained useful for certain missions, special operations, intelligence gathering, nuclear deterrence, but their ability to wage unrestricted commerce warfare against a technologically sophisticated enemy ended in the Atlantic in 1944. The German submariners who mocked the Sonar Buoy in 1942 weren't laughing by 1943. By 1944, they weren't sailing. By 1945, they were dead or captured. The floating cylinders they dismissed as Allied desperation had boxed them in with invisible walls they couldn't breach, walls of sound and surveillance that turned the vast Atlantic into a trap from which there was no escape. The hunters had become the hunted. The laughers had become the silenced. And the ocean, which had hidden submarines for decades, had learned to give up its secrets to anyone who knew how to listen.